Mark's world teeters on the edge of a brutal revelation, and nothing will stop him from exposing the truth. It took a funeral and my 3-year-old daughter to help me see something I had been avoiding for too long. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but suddenly, it was right in front of me. The funeral was for my grandfather, who had passed away unexpectedly, and my daughter Alyssa was there with me. The day after the funeral, we were at my mother's house, getting ready to go home. The car was packed with our bags, and I was putting Alyssa in her car seat. "Do you want to take your shoes off, sweetheart?" I asked her. I already knew what she would say, but I liked hearing her voice. "Yes, please," she replied clearly. I smiled and started to unbuckle her small shoes. I didn't ask about her socks because I knew she preferred them off. That must have come from my side of the family. I'd rather be barefoot than wear tight shoes. With her socks off and her little toes happy to be free, I gently tickled the bottoms of her feet. She was watching me closely, waiting to laugh and wiggle her feet, pretending she wanted to escape my fingers. But really, she loved our game and would have been sad if I didn't do it. It was a special moment for both of us. I realized that we had been playing this game more often lately. We were spending a lot of time together, and it seemed like we both truly enjoyed these moments. The same couldn't be said for my wife, Laura, though. Before I could think much about that, Alyssa spoke again. "Daddy?" she asked as I leaned over to set her shoes on the seat beside her. I carefully placed her socks inside them. "What is it, sweetie?" I answered softly. When she didn't respond right away, I looked into her eyes. "Why doesn't Mommy love us anymore?" she asked. I was taken aback and didn't know how to respond. "Sweetheart, your Mommy loves us both very much," I said slowly. "She especially loves you more than anything." For a moment, I saw hope spark in her eyes, but then it faded away. "But she didn't want to come with us to say goodbye to Grandpa," she said sadly. I didn't have a real answer, just what Laura had told me. "She had to work, honey," I said. I considered explaining how Laura's job required a lot of her time and focus, but I knew it would likely lead to too many questions for a 3-year-old. I was quiet for a while. "Mommy will be home when you get back, sweetie," I said gently. "She'll be waiting for you." "Does she have to work at night too?" Alyssa asked. I was about to say no, believing her mother went out at night with her friends to relax, but I realized that would only bring more questions for Alyssa. "No, sweet girl," I said. "I think Mommy is almost done working so much, and soon she'll have more time to spend with you. And me." I felt the need to change the subject. This was getting awkward. I secured the last strap on the car seat, kissed my little angel on the forehead, and gave her arm a gentle pat before shutting the door. 20 minutes later, she was sound asleep in the back seat while I drove the SUV down the highway. My daughter slept, but I could not. I kept thinking about her sad little words. If a 3-year-old was noticing things, it meant there was more going on than I realized. That's what my wife had hinted at last time I asked why she was going out with friends so often. The sun was nearly gone when we arrived home. My wife Laura was indeed there. Alyssa dashed upstairs, excited to share stories about her cousins from my parents' house. I followed her, still lost in the troubling thoughts that had taken over my mind during the drive. Why was my wife spending so much time at work or out with her friends? I found Laura at her vanity applying makeup. She stood up to kiss my cheek as a greeting. But then I felt a sudden wave of realization I couldn't remember the last time she had kissed me warmly or shown me affection. I sat on our bed and watched. Alyssa chatted with Laura for a while, but her mother barely responded. Even little Alyssa noticed and eventually headed to her own room quietly. Laura kept fussing with her hair and makeup, focused on her appearance. "What's going on, Laura?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My stomach felt tight and it was hard to breathe. "What do you mean, honey?" she replied without looking away from her mascara. She didn't notice my growing concern. "We've been home for only 10 minutes, I said sharply. "And you're planning to go out again?" She paused and glanced at me, clearly annoyed. "Honey, you know I always go out with the girls on Friday nights," she said in a tone that suggested we had talked about this before. I didn't like the way she spoke to me. I felt like she thought she was doing something right when we had talked about it before. "Actually, my dear," I said with a touch of sarcasm, "you go out with your friends almost every Saturday night, some Sundays. Nearly every Wednesday, and most Fridays after work. Those nights seem to run together for you. Alyssa had gone to her room and closed the door after her mother upset her. I could hear one of her toys starting to play a cheerful tune. I got up to close the bedroom door and turned back to Laura, who was standing and looking at me without showing any feelings. I moved closer to her, holding her hands in mine and bringing them close to my heart. "Laura," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want it to break now. "Sweetheart, Alyssa asked me today why you didn't love us anymore, and I need to ask you the same question," I said. Laura's eyes narrowed, letting me know I was crossing a line. I ignored it and continued. Do you still love me?" I asked her, my wife for 6 years. For a moment she didn't reply. Then she pushed back her irritation and leaned against me. "Of course, dear," she said softly. "I love you more today than when we got married. There were times I thought I would burst with happiness." My stomach felt tight, but I tried to relax. Was she happy? But not right now? "Then please stay home tonight," I said, trying to ignore my doubts. I didn't want my voice to sound desperate. Laura sighed, giving me a gentle pat. "We can put Alyssa to bed early," I suggested. "We'll dim the lights and enjoy that bottle of wine we've been saving. How about that?" She initially seemed to respond positively, but when I mentioned the wine, her body tightened, and she tried to step back. I held her wrists to keep her close. "Laura," I said carefully, "are you being unfaithful to me?" I watched her closely as I spoke. I saw a quick flicker in her eyes and a tiny tightening at the corners. They disappeared quickly, but I noticed. I heard her take a sharp breath. What didn't disappear was the quick beating of her heart that I felt through my fingertips. I held her wrists firmly, and my fingers rested on her pulse. It was as clear as any lie detector. I had my answer. "Don't be silly," my wife said. "Sweetheart, I could never love anyone but you. You know that." She leaned against me, resting her head on my shoulder and softly breathing into my neck while giving me gentle kisses. I noticed her hair stayed perfectly in place, not being disturbed. I wondered if Laura felt the chill that ran down my back. She gave my arms a quick pat and then pulled away to check the clock by the bed. "I'm going to be late," she said. "I told my friends I wouldn't let them down again. I have to go, but maybe tomorrow night?" she asked softly. "Laura, we really need some time together," I replied, trying to hide my growing frustration. "Tell your friends you'll see them another time and spend tonight with me and our daughter, please," I suggested. She walked over to her closet and grabbed a short skirt. "I can't let my friends down," she argued. "Why should I do that?" she said with irritation. "Why would you want to let me and our daughter down?" I shot back. "Do we not matter to you anymore?" Laura's expression changed as she became more upset. "I told you tomorrow," she snapped. "I deserve some time for myself without feeling like you are always watching me. I'm not just here for you." We continued to argue. She reminded me that I couldn't control her actions, that she needed time to relax after a long day. I pointed out that I had always given her space. I never complained when she went back to work after our baby was born. I said I was proud of her success as a mid-level manager in her job, even though our family could do well without her working. I supported her career, but I didn't think her job and nights out with friends should come before our family's needs. I got a bit sarcastic saying friends that seemed to make her angrier. She asked what I was accusing her of, and I chose to leave. I was too upset to keep going. I didn't want to say something I might regret later, so I went downstairs and sat on the couch, feeling frustrated. Part of me wanted to stop her from leaving that night, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. When she came down the stairs, I was calmer. We locked eyes. She looked determined, and I felt lost. "Laura," I said, "please don't do this." My voice came out deeper than I meant. She hesitated at the door for a moment, then opened it. "Laura," I called out, a little louder and more serious. "Honey, I love you. I'm begging you, please don't do this to me and Alyssa." Laura looked back at me, her face blank. Then she stepped through the door and closed it firmly behind her. Alyssa came running down the stairs and into the entryway. She opened the outside door and saw the headlights of her mother's car fading down the street. Without a word, she shut the door and quickly walked over to the couch. I recognized her hurried movement. It was as if the floor was too hot to walk on, and she had to get off it fast. She climbed onto the couch near me and stared at the door, hoping her mother would suddenly come back. I watched too. After a moment, Alyssa moved onto my lap and we hugged for a long time before I carried her into the kitchen to make us some sandwiches. It was a cold and uncomfortable weekend between Laura and me. She had come home very late and spent most of Saturday feeling awful from a hangover. After dealing with Laura's bad mood for a while, Alyssa and I decided to go to the park and stayed out until after dinner. Laura was not happy about that. She let me have it when we got home, saying a lot about how I and Alyssa had left her alone. I took it for a little while, but soon got tired of it. I told her she had brought this on herself by leaving us the night before. I said she needed to accept that Alyssa and I spent that afternoon together and had fun. I told her to handle it as best as she could. Whatever she did, I said, and I didn't hide my frustration, she needed to either manage it calmly or keep quiet. I had never spoken to her this way before, and it surprised Laura. The shock seemed to keep her quiet and more focused on Alyssa for the rest of the night. Later that Saturday night, I sensed a change in her mood, so I tried to reconnect with her, but she felt unwell and had to rush to the bathroom. I tried again on Sunday night, but she lay still, not responding at all. Instead of persisting, I turned away and felt angry. After a while, I got up and took another shower, hoping the water would help me relax so I could sleep. It helped a little. Monday morning, I left the house before Laura woke up. I rarely did this because it meant Laura had to get Alyssa up, dressed, fed, and off to daycare. She didn't like that. If she didn't have everything planned out, it usually meant she would be late to work. I wasn't in the mood to pay much attention to Laura's needs that morning. Before I left, I went down to the basement and opened a cabinet that held some old tools. I flipped a switch to turn on a small device that would record every landline phone conversation from my house. Another switch activated a gadget that could pick up cell phone calls within 150 feet of its location. It wasn't exactly legal, but nobody knew about it, and I had no plans to use the information in any legal way. I had already installed security cameras in nearly every room in the house. After watching a documentary about a crime solved using footage from a homeowner's cameras, I decided to set them up everywhere. I also wanted to keep an eye on any babysitters or housekeepers who came to help us. We trusted our housekeeper and the teenagers we hired to watch our baby now and then, but I thought it was smart to check as well. I realized we hadn't needed to hire a babysitter in months. I wasn't sure if the expensive surveillance system was worth it anymore. I entered the tall chain-link fence around the new office building and drove to the business office on the far side. The fence, along with the razor wire on top, went up when we landed our first Department of Defense contract 3 years ago. Since then, the DoD had come back twice for more projects, which were much more profitable. I parked in a clearly marked spot and turned off the engine. I sat there trying to decide what to do. My instincts told me that Laura might have something going on outside our relationship, but my mind reminded me that I had no real evidence. Feeling anxious and a quick breath didn't mean anything concrete. I thought I had seen a hint of guilt in her eyes, but it could have been about something else altogether. At least I hoped so. The logo on the wall in front of my car caught my attention and shook me from my thoughts. I nodded to Phil Sanders, one of the first people I hired. I opened the door, said a quick, "Hello," and grabbed my Palm Pilot and briefcase from the back seat. Instead of rushing inside, I took a moment to admire the bright logo. MA Industries. That's me, Mark Archer. At 34, I was the CEO and president of a small private company that began as a tool manufacturing business 12 years ago. We found a niche creating motor mounts for home security cameras. We worked hard to promote our business and found several private investigation companies that needed good surveillance equipment. Over the years, we built a strong group of customers who trusted us to provide quality remote-controlled mounts. 8 years ago, we acquired a small company that created excellent color cameras with great zoom capability. The entire setup, including a strong transmitter and a separate receiver that could connect to a regular TV, was smaller than a lipstick case. Now our small business had everything we needed, and we started to sell our products all over the state. We also planned to begin selling them online. After that, we merged with a couple of private investigation agencies and formed a department called Information and Surveillance Associates. Within a year, we opened branch offices in 3 more cities. Overall, Massachusetts Industries was doing well while keeping a low profile. In my office, I signed papers that my secretary, Maggie, put in front of me without checking them. They were routine documents that didn't require my attention, but they needed my signature. I liked to joke with her by calling her Radar, and I did so again. She always responded with a smart comment, reminding me to pay attention to what I was doing. Maggie was the glue that held our office together. When she was on vacation, things didn't run smoothly, and I worried about her retirement. To keep her with us as long as possible, I paid her well, along with the 3 vice presidents. She was aware of this, but they weren't. "Maggie," I said when she brought me my first coffee of the day, "can you have Carl Winters come see me?" "Sure," she replied quickly. She looked at me with curiosity. "Can I say why?" she asked. I shook my head, but then realized I needed to explain a bit. Maggie had been like a second mother to me since we started in a renovated warehouse years ago. "Just tell him I need to become a customer of his," I said slowly, not looking at her. She paused for a moment before speaking. "Oh, I'm really sorry, Mark," she said softly. She sniffled and left quickly. I watched her go, wondering what she might know or sense. Carl led our combined surveillance and private investigations division, and Maggie seemed to understand my intent without me explaining. "What's up, Mark?" Carl asked as he entered my office. I motioned for him to close the heavy oak door. I sat quietly, not really focusing on anything, while he took his first sip of tea from the large mug that Maggie had prepared for him when he got here. "Carl," I began, but I paused to clear my throat. It was tough to speak, and my stomach felt tight with anxiety. "Carl, I need to talk to you. I'm worried that Laura might be getting into something she'll regret," I said carefully. I was trying hard to choose my words, not wanting to say outright that I thought she was seeing someone else. "Oh no, Mark," he replied sadly. "I'm really sorry to hear that." We both took a deep breath. Carl set the mug on my desk and stared at his fingernails in silence. I didn't know what to say either. "Well," he finally said after a long pause, "we have everything we need to find out for sure. I can bring in some temporary staff to help so our regular team can focus on this. Can you give me details about Laura's work schedule, her cell phone number, computer logins, credit card details, stuff like that?" I nodded. I hesitated to suggest using our own people for this task instead of outsiders, but I soon realized Carl just wanted the best help possible. Sighing, I reached for my briefcase and pulled it closer. I had spent most of Sunday gathering account numbers and other important information I knew he would need from our documents. I had Carl set up my account as a client of Information and Surveillance Associates. I planned to pay from my personal account to avoid raising any questions. We talked about how to follow Laura to see where she went, who she was with, and what they did. I felt guilty, but I knew that wasn't right. The pain from the past weekend, along with what I'd realized on Friday night, made me feel more distant from Laura. I needed answers. Honestly, if Laura was doing nothing wrong, she would never find out about this, and maybe we could see a counselor to work through our problems. But if she was involved in something inappropriate, I needed to know. By noon, Carl's team had gotten into Laura's car at her office building downtown. It was easy since my name was on the title too, so I gave them my key. They placed a small microphone under the driver's seat. The tiny device could pick up sounds from a mile away and was sensitive enough to hear quiet conversations in the car. A GPS tracker was hidden in the trunk and quickly began sending out the car's location, accurate to just a few feet. Carl had 7 of his best people working on the case and had assigned 5 rental vehicles to the effort. All the cars and vans were checked by our mechanics to make sure they were reliable when needed. There was also a woman, a freelancer with great skills, who applied for a job at Laura's accounting firm and expected to start the next week. Carl told me to relax and let him handle everything. There were procedures for situations like this, and it was best for me to stay out of it for now. This only made me feel worse. If Laura was being unfaithful, it was so ordinary that there were already set ways to deal with it. He also told me I had a choice. If they discovered an upcoming meeting, they could intervene if that was my wish, or we could wait and gather evidence for a divorce case. I decided I wanted to interrupt any meeting they found out about. I didn't need to think hard. I just wanted my wife back. He nodded and asked me to avoid upsetting Laura in her daily life. He promised to inform me when we reached a decision point. However, I told him that a tipping point had already passed. That night, I called him from the basement after listening to recordings from the cell phone taps. The information was not legal, but we didn't plan to use it in court. Carl picked up on the second ring. "Carl?" I said. My voice was heavy with emotion, and he sensed it right away. "Oh no, what happened?" he asked, clearly worried. I took a deep breath to steady myself. "You know the phone taps I had you set up when we built the house?" I asked. "Yeah. Sorry we couldn't get to your place today to set up the remote monitoring, but—" "I understand, Carl. There's only so much time in a day. Don't worry about it. Anyway, I recorded a conversation between Laura and a guy named Brian around 7 p.m. I took a shaky breath before continuing. "You'll listen to it tomorrow, but Brian mentioned being with Laura again soon." I felt like crying, but held back the tears. A cold weight settled in my stomach. My body felt heavy, as if I were wrapped in a thick fog that dulled everything. My chest ached. It was hard to breathe. Laura was with someone else, and I didn't understand why. I couldn't think of any reason for her to seek affection outside our marriage, and it hurt to think about how she could betray me and our daughter. I tried to clear the tight feeling in my throat. "Anyway, Carl," I said when I felt calmer, "we need to change our plans. Tomorrow morning I will call Pete and start the divorce process with Laura, so now we need to gather as much evidence as we can." Pete is Peter Robinson, a well-known lawyer who works for MA Industries, and he is also my personal lawyer. "Yeah, Mark, I guess there's not much else to do," Carl replied, speaking slowly. "I'm really sorry, Mark. I don't know how else to say it," he said. His kindness helped a bit. "I know, Carl," I said, feeling a bit stronger. "Thanks, partner, but this is all on Laura. No one else is to blame. I have a little girl who will be heartbroken. She and I are the ones hurt by this, and I don't understand why Laura did it." I focused my thoughts. I didn't want to dwell on being the wronged husband after this moment. "Okay, I just wanted you to know we will start working on a new plan right away," I told him. "I'll see you in the office tomorrow morning, all right?" "Sure, Mark," he said. "Take care tonight, okay? Don't do anything you might regret," he said seriously. I knew he meant not to take any rash actions against my wife. "I'm fine, Carl," I assured him. "I looked over the recordings of this situation 3 hours ago, and I'm well past that." I paused for a moment. "I will tell you, Carl, I won't be with her tonight or any night. I'll have to come up with a reason, but I can't be close to someone who betrays me like this. There are limits for me. I know it might make things harder, but I just can't do it." My voice shook with those last words, but Carl didn't mention it. "That's okay," he said in a calming voice. "It might take a bit longer, Mark, but people who do these things often think they can hide it. They believe their secrets are safe, yet it's usually easy for others to notice what they're up to." I stayed silent. "Just hang in there, boss," Carl encouraged me. "This will work out no matter how it unfolds, you hear? You'll come through this even stronger." "I hope so," I said, but I wasn't sure. All I could see was a future filled with pain and embarrassment for me and my daughter. I hadn't even started to think about how badly this would affect her. "Okay, Mark, call me if you need anything, all right? Even if you just want to talk," he said. I promised I would and then pressed the off button on my phone. I turned the equipment back on to pick up any more messages between my wife and whoever she was seeing. That night, I slept in a guest room down the hall. I told Laura I had a dry throat and felt a bit stuffy, which might make me snore a lot. She quickly accepted this without saying much. I mentioned it would also be closer to Alyssa if she needed something at night. Laura hadn't known our little girl had wet the bed a couple of times last week, but she just shrugged it off and went back to her magazine. I could see that my daughter's struggles didn't seem to matter to Laura. The next afternoon, Carl came to me with a report. Laura's companion turned out to be Brian Collier, one of the accounting managers from her office. He was married and had a son who was 9 and a daughter who was 7. His wife's name was Pamela, and she worked part-time in another office. Brian was 38, a bit taller than me, but thinner. In my teens, I had been an amateur boxer and had done weightlifting to build my strength. I stopped boxing when I went to college, but I still lifted weights a few times a week. The photo Carl found showed that Mr. Collier appeared to be more of a runner than a weightlifter. I wasn't sure what women found attractive, but I thought he seemed to be just average looking. I wondered what it was about him that made Laura forget our promises to each other and meet him. Carl had managed to get Laura's phone records for the last 2 years by using a contact he had. A quick look at the records showed that at first, there were only a few calls between them over several months. Then, about 6 months ago, the calls started happening weekly and soon after, daily. Now they were happening 2 or 3 times a day, mostly at night or early in the morning. Carl knew when I left for work and told me that Laura and Brian were talking almost every morning after I left the house. The evening calls were almost always started by Laura, likely when I was busy in the basement lifting weights with Alyssa by my side. The timing fit with my normal workout routine. "Do you know what happened around the time the phone calls started to increase?" Carl asked. He was very professional about everything, and I appreciated that. It made it a little easier for me to handle. I leaned back in my chair to think and rested my feet on the corner of my desk. Seeing me relax, Carl did the same on his side. Then it hit me. "Oh, maybe not. She went to a training seminar a couple of weeks before that in Chicago with a company that hired her firm to check their financial records," I said, feeling unsure. Memories started to come back to me as I thought. "You know," I said, but paused as a piece of memory came together in my mind. The rest of that week and the next 2 were quiet at home. Laura had canceled all but Friday's night out, and Carl's contacts confirmed the ladies went out to a couple of clubs, dancing with anyone who asked. They all went home afterward. Brian was a good husband and stayed home with his wife and kids. I read a report that suggested Brian's wife was not very happy to have him home, and she talked about his sudden change in behavior. I was surprised that the investigators' questioning of the girls didn't last long, but I suppose there was some arrogance in Laura and Brian's attitude toward me. After all, they had been friends for a while. Whatever it was, just 3 weeks after the investigators spoke to the Friday night group, cell phone calls began to increase and became more direct. The 2 cheating spouses thought everything was fine and believed I wouldn't suspect anything. During this time, I had mostly moved into the spare bedroom. I could barely kiss Laura goodnight, and there was no way I was going to be intimate with her. She hinted a few times that she was interested, but I didn't respond. I read Alyssa every book in her little collection and bought more for us to enjoy together. After I faked a harsh cough, Laura didn't question why I was staying away from her. She never mentioned that I should stay away from the baby with a cough like that. Meanwhile, Carl and his team noticed that the late-night phone calls between Laura and Brian were happening more often. On Wednesday of the 3rd week, Laura and Brian planned to meet at their usual motel. Carl had everyone eager to gather proof about the 2, and Pete, my lawyer, had me prepared on how to behave. I had Mandy, a 16-year-old girl from down the street, ready to babysit Alyssa that night. "Laura," I said, "please don't go out tonight." I stood in the living room as she headed for the door. "Please, Laura," I urged. I was serious. I really didn't want her to meet that man out there. "Mark!" Laura snapped at me. Realizing she couldn't leave without trying to calm me down, her expression softened. "Look, nothing is happening, Mark. I'm just going out for a few drinks and some dancing, that's all," she said with a sweet smile. She hugged me tightly and looked me in the eyes, trying to convince me that I was wrong about what I believed she was planning. "Laura," I said suddenly, "I know you're meeting someone tonight, but you can't possibly care for him as much as you do for Alyssa and me. Please don't go." Laura pulled back and let go of me. She looked a bit uneasy, wondering what I knew. "What are you talking about?" she asked, sounding defensive. I had to admit she was becoming quite good at this. "I just know," I insisted. "I know you're with someone else. You're not just being unfair to me. You're unfair to Alyssa, too." She relaxed a bit, realizing that without a name, my worries could just be doubts. "I'm not seeing anyone else," she said firmly. "I'm tired of these accusations, and they need to stop," she added. "If you keep it up, I might just go out to find someone else to show you what I mean." I had to look away, feeling anger brewing inside me. "Laura," I said softly. It was hard to get the words out because I was so upset. "Not another word," she said sharply. "I have never, I am not now, and I never will be with another man but you. Does that make you feel better?" She turned and walked toward the door, pulling on a light jacket. I noticed she wasn't wearing much underneath. "Laura," I said, trying to stay calm, "if you ever cheat on me, it would end everything between us. We talked about this when Georgia and Sam broke up last year, remember? For a moment, her hand paused on the doorknob. "I told you," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear a hint of annoyance. "I promise I don't want anyone but you, and I never will." "Now I'm late, and I have to go," she said firmly. Without a glance back, she opened the door and left. 20 minutes later, I joined Carl and a few of his friends in a room nearby, where Brian and Laura would soon be. After hearing my concerns tonight and the suspicious questions from Laura's friends in the past, it seemed Brian and Laura were driving around to see if anyone was following them. The GPS showed us that. In reality, there was no one behind them. Carl found out about the motel reservation shortly after it was made because the desk clerk had been paid to call him. Since we already knew where they were going, there was no need to follow them. If we hadn't known, Carl would have used several cars to keep an eye on Laura and her friend from nearby streets. With the GPS devices in both of their cars, they would not have noticed anyone trailing them. After a little while, Laura and Brian arrived at the motel in their cars and parked in front of room 113. The motel had outside entrances to all the rooms, so the two just needed to step out of their cars and walk a few steps to the door. They didn't see the dark van across the street, nor did they notice the camera recording their every movement. Laura and Brian embraced and shared a kiss. Carl was watching me carefully. He knew I wanted to charge out the door. "Mark," he said softly, "things will get tougher before it's done. Are you ready for this?" I sat back down on one of the beds, feeling anxious. "Do you have something to drink?" I asked him. He misunderstood and shook his head. "No, but you should take this medicine," he said, holding out a small yellow tablet. "It will help calm you." I accepted it and grabbed a soft drink from the cooler he had brought. Carl had managed to sneak a high-quality camera into the room, hiding it in the air conditioning vent. It could capture full-color video and had a wide range of motion. It even had a strong zoom, but Carl didn't expect to need that level of detail. Once they went inside the room, things began happening quickly. Laura took off her dress in no time. Brian followed suit. When they were on the bed, we turned off all the lights in our room and two of Carl's men quietly stepped outside. Along with the camera in the vent, Carl had brought two small cameras. One was slid under the door to Laura's room, and the other was placed over the top of it. The cameras were small enough to fit easily through the gaps, leaving the rest outside. Once the cameras were in place, they attached the transmitters in a way that kept them hidden. In the dark, the spy devices were hard to spot from a distance. To make this better, the guys took down the only outside light that could brighten the place before they came back inside. The cameras were already set up, and we got ready to watch. The idea was that if one camera missed something, the other two would catch it. Actually, there wasn't much to see. There was no warmth, no care, and no love. Brian just put on a condom and got to it with my wife in a way that felt wrong. I looked at her face for a moment. I couldn't tell if she was feeling pain or something else from the frown on her forehead. "Damn," I said after watching for a bit. "That guy isn't any bigger than me. His size isn't even close," I complained. "What's going on here?" It was true. Laura had once measured me when we got married, and she had used a ruler a few times. She found out I was 7 inches long and thought that was impressive. She noticed that most of the other women in our neighborhood were satisfied with less. Laura felt lucky that my size was on the larger side of average. She would often tease me, asking for more when we were together. But we hadn't done that in a while. I thought I had a clue why. But I also didn't. Brian was obviously not very big, and he had to try hard to please Laura. Plus, his movements were clumsy and awkward. I wondered what she saw in him. A bit later, I felt a small thrill. I noticed Sherry, one of Carl's co-workers, glancing at me for a moment. She looked at the TV screens, then shook her head and smiled. I thought I saw some curiosity in her eyes. We both looked away quickly. She worked with me, and I wasn't about to act carelessly at work. Still, she was charming. Maybe she wouldn't always work for me. An opportunity might come up soon. After a while, I decided to leave. There was nothing else to watch. Brian and Laura kept going through the same routine, taking breaks and then starting again. Brian had no creativity in their time together. They only changed positions a couple of times. Laura refused to let him do certain things, and it dragged on without excitement. I couldn't help but wonder what Laura saw in him and why she was risking our 6 years of marriage. The two cheaters didn't see each other for a week, and they were both very frustrated with the situation that kept them apart. It seemed like their schedules just weren't fitting together, and they didn't know how to fix it. One day, Kathy approached Laura with an idea for them to take a weekend trip to Las Vegas. The team investigating Kathy had gathered a lot of information about her. They discovered that Kathy had a reputation for being bitter and had distanced herself from her family because of past problems. During a phone call that neither realized was being listened to, Kathy shared more about her plan. She said that she had won 2 free tickets to Vegas through a radio contest and invited Laura to join her. It was clear from the conversation that Kathy wanted this trip to be a getaway just for the two of them. She even mentioned buying a large number of supplies for the trip. Laura quickly agreed to go, but she unexpectedly invited Brian along too. When Kathy heard about this in a later call, she didn't seem pleased, but she didn't say anything against it. It appeared that Brian had to cover his own expenses for the trip. He didn't seem thrilled about that, based on the short and irritated way he spoke during his last call. I couldn't believe he thought Laura should pay for him to come along. Pete, my lawyer, mentioned he was planning to serve Kathy with legal papers. She had known for a while that both Laura and Brian were married. By encouraging Laura to spend the weekend in Vegas, she was playing a part in the whole situation. Pete didn't believe she had any money to gain from, nor did he think the lawsuit would go far in court, but he aimed to make her feel the weight of her actions. He wanted her to think twice before causing problems for others. We debated whether to end this issue now with what we had from the hotel or wait until the Vegas trip. I was leaning towards stopping the deceit immediately and starting the divorce process with Laura. Pete thought it would be better to let things unfold a bit more. He believed that the trip and the lies involved would create undeniable proof of their disregard for their commitments. Lawyers have their own way of talking. What Pete really wanted was for Laura to clearly show she had crossed the line in her actions or words. As it turned out, he got evidence of both. The investigators were at the same casino hotel where Kathy, Brian, and Laura were staying. They were in one of the 2 towers, while Carl and 5 of his associates were in a room in the other tower, able to see directly into the room where Laura and her friends were. It had cost us $500 for the room clerk to give Laura a room on this side of the building, one that could easily be seen from where Carl was. Carl's contact mentioned that the money changed hands quickly, and the clerk probably thought it was the easiest money he had ever made. Just a couple of 100 feet from Laura's room, Carl had set up 3 cameras to capture what was happening. He told me there was a good chance they would capture something useful. He mentioned that people in high-rise buildings often feel a sense of safety due to their height and distance from others, which he had noticed in many of his previous cases. Even if the shades were closed, Carl's team had a device that could pick up tiny vibrations or sounds from Laura's room. We wouldn't get video, but the audio would be clear enough to identify the speakers if needed. Carl said this kind of technology had been developed during the Cold War by both Russian and Western spies to gather information. The phone call I was about to make was also going to be recorded. I was supposed to call Laura for one last effort to persuade her to stop her actions and come back to me. I knew it was just a script from my lawyer, but I secretly hoped it might work. I felt a mix of heat and cold rushing through me. My emotions were a whirlwind. All I knew was that I felt pain and had an upset stomach, even though I hadn't eaten all day. Carl and his team had left me at home, but I could still watch through the cameras they set up. A detective following them had seen them already drinking a lot on the plane. "Laura," I said into the cell phone. On the webcam, I could see Laura on the bed, trying to reach for the phone on the nightstand. Kathy was standing nearby, appearing to support Brian. "What?" she replied sharply into her cell phone as she pulled away slightly. I noticed that Brian had a different colored protection this time. It looked odd, but at least he was trying. Kathy sat on the bed beside Laura, directing Brian's attention, though it seemed he wasn't doing a good job of keeping her happy. Laura paced back and forth, looking uneasy. "Laura," I said again, "please, don't do this." I caught myself just in time from saying the man's name aloud. I was supposed to keep my distance and observe, not interfere or reveal that I knew too much. "Come home, please. We can figure this out." I tried to sound calm, using the exact words my lawyer advised, words meant to show Laura's choices as indifferent to our marriage. Laura, please think of Alyssa. Think of what this could do to her. It's amazing how someone can keep hoping, even while watching their world start to fall apart. I loved Laura and wanted to see some spark of hope for us, but there wasn't any. I might still love her, but I didn't like who she was in that moment. She quickly reminded me of that feeling. "Leave me alone," Laura yelled into the phone. "I told you already I'm not doing anything wrong, and I'm tired of you not trusting me." I shook my head, watching her. How could she say that when she stood right there with someone else, clearly choosing to do what she wanted? Her words were quiet for a moment, and then she stepped closer to her friends, as if she didn't care if I watched. "Here's what, dear," she said finally in a sarcastic tone. "Maybe I'll go out and find someone new tonight just to make you right for once. How would you like that?" I was stunned at the bitterness in her voice. This was the same woman who had once found comfort in our home, someone who sought my arms to hold her when things were hard. I remembered the warmth she brought, her soft presence, the person I thought I could rely on. "Laura," I said quietly, "I don't understand why you want to throw everything away. Think of Alyssa. Think of what this will do to her." Laura cut me off with another outburst. "Go to hell!" she screamed. She was nearly incoherent. Watching her through the screen, I could only just make out her words. "When I get home, we are going to finish this, and don't expect me to stay either." "I wanted to talk to you before the lawyers get involved," Laura said carefully. She pulled out a chair a little distance away and sat down. It had been almost 4 months since she lost her job and moved in with her brother. Her hair was back to being nearly shoulder length. She had cut it when she started working at the accounting firm, wanting to look more professional. She seemed thinner and didn't move easily. It looked like she hadn't been eating or sleeping well. There were dark circles under her eyes. I felt for her, but I kept my feelings hidden. In this personal moment, I wore my business mask, a face I usually showed only to colleagues. It was often a tough one. "And now, you are here," I said quietly. She nodded, looking away from me for a moment. But then she had to look at me. "Mark," she said softly, "I'm really sorry for what I've done to you and to our daughter." I stayed silent. I know saying sorry is not enough, and it can't undo the pain I've caused, but it's all I can say, she whispered. "I'm struggling too, Mark. I don't understand why I acted like I did, and it's eating at me." She didn't say anything more, so I broke the silence. "I have to disagree," I said plainly. "You haven't truly experienced suffering until you have to explain to a 3-year-old that her mother might not come back." Laura started to cry quietly. "It's been 4 months since I had to tell her that, Laura, and she still cries every night. It's only recently that I've been able to get a smile out of her now and then." I paused, watching her as she cried in her chair. "She gets very upset if I leave her somewhere for too long," I said softly. "She's scared that I won't come back for her. Can you imagine what that fear is like for a little girl who's not even 4? Can you?" I took a deep breath while Laura continued to cry. "She's at a new daycare here at the company," I told her. "I built one nearby so I can always be just a few minutes away. Any longer than that and she starts to panic when I'm not around," I said, watching Laura as she cried quietly. Trying to lighten the mood, I added, "Well, on the bright side, work productivity is up for the single parents here. It's almost already paid for itself." But my attempt didn't seem to matter to her. Silence hung between us. "Why?" I asked as softly as I could. "Why'd you do this, Laura? I loved you more than anything and you tore me apart. There's this emptiness inside me now, and I can't even think about moving forward until I understand why you did this." She only shook her head, tears flowing down her cheeks. She hadn't worn any makeup, probably expecting she'd cry. She still looked beautiful, maybe even more so now than when we'd first met. My heart was breaking watching her, but I held it together. I remembered losing my younger brother in an accident when I was a teenager. That loss hurt deeply, but today felt worse. I didn't know how to fix any of this or if the ache inside would ever go away. "I don't know why," she said after a while. "Maybe there's something wrong with me." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I can't take back what I've done, Mark," she said softly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. I hurt the only man I ever truly loved. I'll carry the weight of that for the rest of my life, and I don't know how to handle it." I feel so much shame for the hurt I caused, even to our sweet little girl. When I think back to that night, hearing myself scream those terrible words, it's unbearable." She looked up at the ceiling, her face wet with tears. After a long while, her crying finally eased, and she seemed drained, like she couldn't cry anymore. I put the remote control away, deciding not to revisit old moments. She knew the harm well enough. "I'm seeing a counselor," she continued. "A psychologist. I'm trying to understand why I hurt everyone so badly." She twisted her hands, clearly struggling with her own feelings. "I also went to see Stacy Collier," she added. "I apologized for what I did to her family. She was kind to me," Laura murmured, surprised. "I don't know why." She stared down at the heavy wooden table in front of her, lost in thought. "Stacy told me Brian often found himself drawn to other women wherever he worked. She said she got used to it, but this time she's finally had enough. She's divorcing Brian and she's already moving on. She met a nice man who cares for her children, and she says he's the best thing that ever happened to her. I knew that Stacy was ending her marriage and had a new partner, but I didn't know Laura had gone to apologize to her. This showed that Laura felt sorry for what she had done and was ready to take responsibility. I started to feel something inside, a hope that maybe things could get better. "What is the doctor saying?" I asked. Laura looked at me for a moment, then stared down at the table. "We haven't made any progress," she said. "I wish I could tell you different. All I know is that I got really heavy into drinking it." "Were you given something, Laura?" I interrupted. For the first time, she met my gaze, and I could see a mix of emotions on her face. "I don't know," she finally said. "Maybe the first time. The first time I was with Brian, I know I was very drunk." She looked down again, her voice quieter. "But I wasn't given anything. Sometimes I wasn't even drunk. After that," she added. Her tears started again, but she tried to control them. "I wish I had an excuse," she said softly. "But I don't. I'm working with my counselor to find out the real reasons." She paused, and I shifted in my seat. "Mark." I raised my eyebrows in response. "Would you visit her? She wants to talk to you, but it's not what you think. She just has some questions. She wants to see if there's anything I haven't been able to explain." Laura's words came out quickly. She seemed to want to share everything before I had a chance to react. "When?" I asked simply. Laura looked at me in surprise. "You'll go?" she asked, feeling emotional. I shrugged. "I'm still your husband," I replied seriously. "I'll do what I can to help you, as long as it doesn't hurt. Our child." I almost said my child, but I caught myself. Hope sparked in her eyes, growing stronger. I almost said something harsh to remind her there was little chance for change, but I stopped myself. I was ready to consider anything that could be best for my little girl. I had loved Laura deeply, and I still did. Love isn't something that can be turned off easily, but that didn't erase the deep hurt I felt either. Still, I had to think of my daughter, and that priority was undeniable. It held more weight than anything else. I would do anything to help her heal. "Tomorrow afternoon?" Laura asked, her voice shaky. "Is that too soon? I can call and see if she's available another time. Is 2 o'clock okay?" "Yes, tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock works for me," I replied. "I'll be there." Laura began to cry again, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Ho," she started, but I wasn't sure what she was going to say next. "Thank you, Mark," she finally finished. As she stood up, it reminded me of someone much older trying to rise. "Before you leave," I said, "I've been tested and everything came back negative. Have you?" She nodded. "I always made him use protection," she replied bitterly. "At least I did that." I sat quietly for a moment. Protection isn't always foolproof, but my results were clear. "Laura," I said calmly, "do you have anything else you want to say about the difficult months we went through?" She flinched at my words, but sat up tall and met my gaze. "No," she said quietly. "I told you I'm very sorry for what I did to you and Alyssa. I don't know why I acted that way, and I can't even begin to ask for your forgiveness. Those are the things I needed to say, and I wanted to ask if you would talk with Dr. Jameson," she added. I paused, waiting for her to share anything else. She seemed as if she had finished everything on her list. "Laura, please sit with me," I invited. She took a seat and turned to face me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for me to speak. When your lawyer asked if I would meet with you, I pictured a lot of different things. I wondered if you would yell at me like you did that night in Vegas. I paused, noticing her head droop in response. I remembered the shame on her face when she realized what she had done. I tried to reach out to you again, she said softly. Once I understood everything, I felt so overwhelmed with guilt. I knew that feeling. It was clear in the footage Carl had shown me. She had barely engaged with someone else before breaking away to grab her phone in a panic. Laura had been crying and upset, showing real remorse for her actions. It was too late to change things, but the sincerity was there. I understand, I said gently. When I heard that you wanted to say sorry, I thought you'd try to make excuses like, it just happened, or it didn't mean anything. I often see that on those reality shows about unfaithful couples. If you'd said those things or tried to blame it all on me, I would have had you asked to leave right away. Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face again. I poured her a glass of cold water from a jug and slid it across the table. She thanked me with her eyes. You didn't say anything like that. Your mother told me you never spoke poorly about me to your family. She said you took full responsibility from the moment you went back home. Laura lifted her hands, looking lost for words. I took a deep breath, feeling anxious about what I might be about to do. It felt like a step back from a strong position, but I had a daughter who was struggling with her fears. It had been ages since I heard her joyful laughter. If there was even a small chance to bring that back, I had to try. I needed it for my own peace, too, as the sadness inside me was becoming too much. Laura, I said gently, there's a restroom over there. I pointed to a small door off to the side. Why don't you go and freshen up a bit? She nodded, relieved to have a moment away to compose herself. Before she walked too far, I grabbed a bottle of eye drops from my desk and placed it near her hand. Here, I said softly as she stood, use a little of this. It should help with the redness in your eyes. She nodded again in thanks. I picked up the phone and pressed a button for my assistant downstairs. Maggie, I said when she picked up, can you please bring Alyssa from the daycare center to conference room C? Thank you, Maggie. I hung up the phone. Laura was halfway to the restroom when she suddenly turned around, looking at me in disbelief. She couldn't believe I had said what she thought I had. For a long moment she just stared, unsure if I truly meant. Laura, I said gently, I would have let you see her any time you wanted. I would never keep her away from you, you know that? She lowered her head again. I felt too guilty about what I'd said and how I'd been treating her, she admitted. I worried that I would start crying and couldn't stop. That wouldn't have helped her at all. She stood there for a moment, lost in thought. Are you sure this is okay? She asked me softly. I looked into her eyes, searching for any sign that it was fine or not before time ran out and Alyssa entered the room. I made a quick decision, trusting my instincts as I often do in business. She'll be here in a few minutes. Don't you think you should get ready to see her? I said quietly. Laura started crying again, but she smiled through her tears. She turned and hurried into the restroom, trying to wipe her tears with a tissue as she went. I looked out the big window at the bright sun while I waited for my daughter to come upstairs. Thank you for being here, Mr. Archer, said a neatly dressed but strong-looking older woman. Can I call you Mark? She asked. I shrugged. Can I call you Janice? I replied. I had seen her name on the door outside. She looked surprised and finally locked eyes with me instead of looking away. I think I should keep things professional, she said. So please call me Doctor if that's all right. Her calm voice made it clear she meant no harm. I nodded in agreement. Professional works for both of us, I said. She stared at me for a moment, tapping her pen on the notepad in front of her. I held her gaze. Laura told me you let her see her daughter yesterday, she said. I'm not sure if you know how much that meant to your wife. I snorted in response. Doctor, don't treat me like I don't understand, I said, my voice a bit sharper. I didn't wait for her response. Of course, I know how important it was for her, and for our daughter too, I added. The doctor looked at me, her expression uncertain. Yes, she said slowly. It was a good visit for both of them. I hope you plan to let them see each other again. I nodded. As long as I can see progress in Laura's situation, I said plainly. I told her yesterday, and I'll tell you now, Doctor. If she goes back to her old ways, I won't hesitate to stop those visits. Dr. Jameson looked at me closely. But then I may need to find the best specialists for my little girl, I said quietly, because both she and I would be struggling. The doctor was silent for a moment. You are a very insightful man, Mr. Archer, she said thoughtfully. You have a firmness about you that surprises me based on what Laura has told me. I understand that you show one side to people at work and another side to your family. She stared at me thoughtfully for a long time. Allowing Laura and Alyssa to be together and hoping they could start to heal shows that you care deeply for your family, she finally said. There didn't seem to be a question in that, so I remained quiet. Do you know Laura cares for you so much that she is feeling guilty about what she did? The doctor surprised me with her comment, perhaps expecting me to react quickly. I looked at her calmly and paused before replying. Yes, I know that, I replied. But love might not be enough to overcome this, I added. Do you understand that there are many deep wounds my daughter and I carry that have only just begun to heal, and there's no guarantee they will ever get better? I looked at my wife's doctor, feeling a bit defiant. I sensed that the doctor thought Laura was the one in pain and that I might be the cause of her struggles. Dr. Jameson looked at me with more understanding than I anticipated. Yes, Mr. Archer, I do understand. Trying to help those wounds heal is my job here, she said softly. I hope I can assist all of you in coming to terms with what occurred and finding a way to move forward as a family. I shook my head. Doctor, before we even think about moving forward, I need to know why this happened, I told her. Laura caused so much hurt that I don't know how I can ever feel whole again. If I can't heal, we will never be a family again. I stared directly at the doctor. I was aware that I was showing some defiance now. I felt anxious as well. I had allowed this woman, a psychologist, but still a woman, to peek into my feelings. Given what had happened with Laura just 4 months ago, this could be risky for my peace of mind. 2 months later, have you and Dr. Jameson discussed Aunt Ruth? I was watching Alyssa run through a maze of strong, hollow tubes hanging from the ceiling at Chuck E. Cheese's. I could only see her through the occasional window and a few clear plastic areas in the large round pipes. The joyful sounds of children playing in the fun space created a lively background for the conversation I was having with Laura, which suited me well. The place was comfortable enough for us to talk, but public enough to give us some space. Yes, she said, speaking just loud enough for me to catch over the noise. But I'm not sure what she wants to know about Aunt Ruth and Dad, she added, a bit distracted. She was also watching Alyssa, slightly worried that an older girl was guiding her through some of the sections. I was surprised to hear that Laura's counselor was asking about her father. What did you say about your dad and aunt? I asked her. She looked at me confused. What do you mean? She replied. You mentioned that Dr. Jameson was asking about your Aunt Ruth and your dad, I explained. She shrugged and shook her head gently. I'm sorry, I was distracted by our daughter. Mark, she said, sounding apologetic. I don't really know why I brought that up. She's been curious about Aunt Ruth, but we aren't making much progress. Honestly, I'm a bit tired of talking about it. I understand, I said. After a long talk with Dr. Jameson a few weeks ago, I was paying more attention to what Laura said. Aunt Ruth was your mom's sister, right? I asked. Laura nodded. Yeah, Mom and Dad were really sad when Aunt Ruth had her stroke and passed away, she explained. That makes sense, I replied. Ruth lived with your parents for many years, didn't she? I was trying to piece together some unclear memories. I didn't know her family well, but I liked them. Yes, Laura said. She got up and walked a little to see our daughter, who was playing nearby. Alyssa was a bit late getting to the next clear section of the tubing. I was confident we would see her again soon. Your parents were close to Ruth, huh? I asked when Laura returned to me. Yes, they were, she said. After Aunt Ruth's husband died, she moved in with Mom and Dad. That was about 25 years ago, I think. Just then, Alyssa came running towards us, with another girl following closely behind. Introducing her, Alyssa said the girl's name was Terry, and she was almost 5 years old. Terry's parents waved from a nearby table, smiling as Alyssa offered her a slice of pizza. Terry had a younger brother and a baby sister, both of whom were crying, and their parents looked busy. Laura and I chatted for another 45 minutes while the two girls enjoyed their pizza and played together. I was trying to understand more about Laura and her background. I looked for deeper meanings in everything she said, which was tiring. I felt a strong urge to express my frustration over her actions, but Dr. Jameson had made it clear that Laura was going through a tough time emotionally. I wasn't sure how to respond anymore. Can you be upset with someone who is struggling with their feelings? It felt a lot like blaming a child for something they couldn't control. Neither of you can control what happened, and neither of you is to blame for it, right? Alyssa enjoyed our time at the children's pizza place, especially meeting another kid her age. When we left, she skipped through the parking lot, holding on to both my and Laura's hands. When we dropped Laura off at her brother's, Alyssa accepted it calmly, unlike the tears and upset of last week, the first time we'd tried a family outing since the separation. I'd explained the situation to Alyssa in simple terms, like when she was sent to her room for misbehaving. She seemed to understand and was better able to cope with being apart from her mom this way. When she asked why her mom wasn't with us, I explained that just as I didn't tell others when she was sent to her room, it wouldn't be fair to discuss her mom's actions. Alyssa didn't like that but accepted it, letting it go surprisingly easily. She fell asleep on the way home. The next morning, I called Dr. Jameson to ask if Laura's unexpected mention of her father and aunt in our last conversation might mean something. As before, she told me that anything Laura avoided discussing could be important. She promised to keep me informed of anything she discovered in Laura's next counseling session. 9 days later. Dr. Jameson hesitated as though debating what to say. Mr. Archer, in our first session, you mentioned that neither you nor Laura were inexperienced when you got married, right? I nodded, not quite seeing where this was going. The doctor decided to press on after another pause. Well, Laura did say I could be completely open with you, Dr. Jameson began cautiously. Mr. Archer, what would you think if I told you Laura hadn't in fact been with anyone before you? I was confused and probably showed it. Mr. Archer, Laura didn't technically meet the definition of inexperience, but you were the first person she'd been with. I leaned back, taken aback. Doctor, I'm not sure what to say, I replied. I didn't get that impression she seemed as ready as I was. I don't really understand. Because you had experience, you naturally led her through it, likely without even realizing she lacked any, she explained gently. Somehow, she got the impression that being experienced mattered to you. She'd been using, well, let's just say practicing on her own, but that's all. I looked at her without understanding. But why would she think that? And why has she never told me? I asked. What difference would it have made? The doctor shrugged. We may never know, she said. It could have been a casual comment, or the absence of one. A simple action. There's no way to tell. Your wife mentioned her lack of experience, and she found some humor in it. I believe that, while she may not remember the exact reason, it affected her self-esteem in the beginning. She talked about it while we were discussing her relationship with that less than charming fellow. The doctor started to play with her notepad. The thing is, Laura told me about it quite openly, she said. It wasn't a big deal for her, at least not anymore. She fiddled with her pen for a moment. Mr. Archer, I hope I can explain this in a way you can understand. She looked at me closely, trying to gauge my reaction. She sighed. I might as well dive in, she said. Taking a deep breath, she continued. I'm fairly certain that one reason Laura got involved with that man was to change the way things felt in your early marriage. I've seen signs that Laura was trying to guide him in being a better partner, though it didn't go very well. This shift in roles seemed to help her deal with some deeper issues. What were those issues? I asked, knowing I looked worried. The doctor was trying to stay neutral about Laura's relationship, but I didn't feel detached. I'm not exactly sure, she admitted. I think it might have something to do with feelings she kept hidden about your guidance during her first experiences. Laura has a bit of a rebellious side, it seems. This may relate somehow to her relationship with her father. He appears to have been a distant, strict figure, yet someone she loved dearly as a child. I haven't even really begun to understand that yet. I opened my mouth to speak, but the doctor raised her hand to stop me. It won't all come out at once, Mr. Archer, she said. Some days we might make a lot of progress, while other days we might not move forward at all. In fact, some of the leads we have could turn out to be incorrect. This isn't an exact science, she said firmly. But couldn't she have worked through those feelings with me? Couldn't she have talked to me about it? Together? Oh, certainly, Dr. Jameson replied almost cheerfully. But only if she was aware of those feelings in the first place. Instead, she chose a different way to reach her goal and also dealt with some other issues along the way. Oh, I see that word isn't your favorite, she said, noticing my reaction. Let's call them problems instead. That works, right? That brings up a good point I wanted to discuss, she continued. Unfortunately, we only have a few more minutes. I'm sorry I couldn't change my next appointment to give us more time, but I thought it was important to talk to you and keep you updated. She paused, looking for the right words. Mr. Archer, things are going to become more difficult. It will get confusing, and I see that you are still holding on to your anger about what has happened. I understand that, and Laura does too. I need you to acknowledge that anger within yourself as well, okay? I nodded. I realized I would need to push down some of my instincts while I considered Laura's emotional struggles. I was willing to do this, but it also bothered me. I couldn't understand why Laura had betrayed my trust. Still, I needed to focus on Alyssa's well-being above everything else. I would continue down this path for her sake. Remember that our discussions are simplified. You asked me to explain things in a way an engineer could understand, right? I'm trying to meet that request while also being honest with you about Laura. I'm not saying you're not smart enough to grasp all the complex feelings and thoughts and human emotions. It's just that you don't have a background in this area. I also consider myself smart, but I wouldn't know how to explain things like vectors or forces. You understand those concepts. They're part of your everyday life. Your mind can handle those ideas while mine struggles with them. Do you see what I'm saying? Meanwhile, you might be thinking of a simple way to define a vector, haven't you? I bet you could come up with a definition that makes sense to me, right? But could that simple explanation actually help the engineers working with you? Probably not. I didn't think so. Do you understand what I'm trying to say and why some things might always be unclear? I gave a little sniff and showed Dr. Jameson a slight smile. All right, Doc, I said. You got yourself off the hook with that last part. You know that, right? Young man, she responded with a calm smile. Why do you think you're paying me so much? 3 weeks later. Honey, I think you should do it. You've said many times that you and the doctor haven't made any progress for weeks now, right? I could have kicked myself. I hadn't wanted to use the term of endearment. It slipped out as I tried to persuade Laura to do something she wasn't keen on. For some reason, getting her to agree to a form of treatment had become my responsibility too. I think the saying is grin and bear it. I did, but I wasn't happy about it. Laura looked up at me as we walked together in the park. She was biting her lip and looked worried. We were close together, but we weren't touching. But it feels like such an invasion, she said with a hint of irritation. I didn't like the tone of her voice. For the first time in a long while, I gently took her wrist and turned her to face me. Her cheeks turned red. I knew her well. She felt a thrill from that small touch. The simple gesture meant more to her than it did to me. I wanted to ensure I wasn't leading her on. I scanned the area and spotted a picnic table under a tall tree a little way off. I let go of her wrist and pointed toward the cool shade. Look, Laura, I said as convincingly as I could, you and Dr. Jameson both agree you aren't making any headway in figuring out your reasons for. What happened, right? She nodded. We reached the table. Laura sat down and I sat across from her. It was much cooler in the shade. Texas summers can be really hot. Then don't you think we need to get this moving again? Shouldn't we be willing to use anything we can to get things back on track? Laura gazed out over the park, looking troubled. The grassy area was mostly empty, with just a few trees scattered around. We had plenty of privacy. I know, Laura replied after a long pause. But it feels like putting me in a trance and exploring my mind is uncomfortable. I just don't know if I can do it. Please understand. Mark, I really don't think it will help. How can you be sure? I asked, my voice a bit sharper than I intended. Laura flinched at my tone. I just don't believe it will be beneficial, she said defensively. She and I can talk a lot more, and I don't mind that. I'm being as open with her as I can, Mark. I was quiet for a long time. Laura was being stubborn, and it felt unreasonable. I had a long phone call with Dr. Jameson, who urged me to encourage Laura to try psychiatric hypnotherapy. She believed Laura was hiding something deep down, something she didn't want to face. The doctor thought that if they could bring these hidden feelings to the surface, Laura could handle them better. The doctor believed there were some tough memories or disappointments that Laura was keeping buried. She felt that bringing these feelings to light would help Laura solve her issues. I wasn't as sure, but it seemed to make sense. I was curious about what Laura might be hiding, assuming she wasn't doing it on purpose. "Laura," I said slowly, "I'm really trying hard to support you through all this counseling. It's very hard for me when I don't understand why you had a long affair." I took a deep breath to calm myself, as anger crept in when I thought of her betrayal. I spoke again. "I need to know why you put so much time and energy into this other person, especially when it hurt Alyssa and me," I told her. "If you don't talk about it, I won't be able to move on. I'll always feel like I've been tricked, that you took something small from our past and used it to justify being with someone else." "That won't work for me, Laura. Even if I try to set aside my hurt, that doubt will ruin us later. But we won't get to that point because I can't ignore this pain. If you don't take this next step, you might as well decide to end our marriage." I paused and watched as Laura leaned over the picnic table, resting her head on her arms while she cried. I tried to stay calm, but it was tough. I considered telling her I might take our daughter away too, but I knew that would be cruel. I decided to keep that thought to myself. I didn't want to use our daughter as a bargaining chip. After a while, Laura's sobs quieted down, and she looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. She nodded her head firmly. "Okay, Mark," she said hesitantly. "I'll do it." The pain on her face was clear. "That's good, honey," I replied, not minding the term of endearment this time. "Will you come with me?" she asked, almost in a whimper. She held her breath and looked tense as she waited for my response. I didn't think twice. "Of course," I said with a soft smile. "Where else would I be?" She smiled back and took my hand in hers. We walked together toward my SUV. I found it wasn't as uncomfortable as I had expected. A week later, Laura had her long meeting with Dr. Jameson 3 days ago on Friday afternoon. I was there, keeping my promise to Laura, but I couldn't go into the room with them. The doctor said it was important for Laura to focus on just one person during the session. If I was in there, she would keep looking at me for help. So I waited in the reception area, trying to remember the articles in the magazines lining the rack. By the time I left, my neck felt stiff. Laura came out of the doctor's office looking pale and clearly disturbed. She didn't want to talk to me, and the doctor didn't either. I felt frustrated. I had waited for 4 hours, and neither of them wanted to share anything. I knew the doctor had met with Laura again for a few hours on Saturday and a bit on Sunday, but I still had no idea what they discussed. I was eager for answers. "Good morning, Mr. Archer," Dr. Jameson said kindly as she sat behind her desk. She leaned back in her chair with her elbows on the armrests, hands resting comfortably on her lap. The doctor seemed calm, but Laura looked far less pleased to be there. I stood in front of the mirror, gazing at my reflection. I looked the same as always, or at least that's what I hoped. I was still 5'5" with shoulder-length brunette hair and green eyes. My skin remained smooth, even as I approached 30 this fall. The faint freckles on my nose were still there. When I take off this dress, I'll see the same shape I've always had. Mark never noticed the slight difference between my two sides. To him, they were both perfect. I wish that were true for me, but I saw it differently. My hips gently curve out from a narrow waist. Mark used to enjoy running his hands along my sides, admiring my shape. He liked to watch me move around and said only someone beautiful could walk with such grace. He doesn't say those things anymore. I feel lost these days. I look into my eyes in the mirror, but I see nothing clear. I can't explain to Mark how much I ache knowing I've hurt him. The shame of my choices weighs heavily on me, and it doesn't go away. If only I could find the words to share my feelings with my husband, the person I love so much, I would. But he wouldn't hear me. I'm worried that I've hurt him too much. We haven't spoken much since that day when Mark left the doctor's office. Our talks have only been brief and mostly about Alyssa. I'm not sure what to say to him. Dr. Jameson says I need to let go of my guilt, but I don't know how to do that. I feel guilty. Guilty for what I did to Mark and to Alyssa. The memory of what I said to him the last night I was with Brian keeps coming back to me. I can't sleep without hearing those hurtful words echo in my mind. I don't deserve someone like Mark. He's right to distance himself from me. I can't explain why those long months spent with Brian feel so strange to me. It's like I was walking on something soft, not feeling the ground beneath me. But at the same time, in my mind, I felt like I was walking on the edge of something sharp. Any wrong step could hurt me deeply, and it felt like I could fall and never get back up. That's how I viewed my life. How do I explain the confusion that filled my mind for so long? I couldn't think clearly. When Mark spoke to me, his words were just sounds lost in the chaos inside my head. I wanted to understand him, but I simply couldn't. It's really difficult to recall the things I did. I try to remember because I want to heal, but it feels like I can't find anything to grasp. Everything from those days and months feels like it happened to someone else. It's like I was watching myself from a distance. Dr. Jameson listens when I say this. She says she understands, but I don't think anyone truly can. Sometimes, I feel like I might burst apart into so many pieces. I don't know where this will lead. Part of me thinks that one day everything will just be calm again. It's been 3 months now, 3 months since Mark and I met with Dr. Jameson. I feel better. I'm not scared anymore when she wants to help me relax. She can guide me quickly now. It's not like the shows you see where they snap their fingers, but I'm able to focus much better, and she can ask me anything. I'm not embarrassed by anything she brings up anymore. She has found out so much about me, and when she brings me back, we talk about what we discussed while I was in that relaxed state. Sometimes, when I mention things outside that calm state, it feels like they disappear as if they were never there. I don't quite understand how that works, but Dr. Jameson says it's my mind's way of handling things. She explains that talking about them helps me face and set aside the memories as if they were clothes I no longer want to wear. It does feel good to let them go. I feel clean and refreshed again, but the pain always comes back when I think about my little girl and my husband. Take it one step at a time, Dr. Jameson tells me. Big issues don't get fixed quickly. They need time and effort. Sometimes Dr. Jameson helps me see things differently. She encouraged my parents to come visit from Albany for a week. It was hard for me to face my father and tell him how much he hurt me when I saw him with Aunt Ruth. I mentioned how bad it felt to see him with her, and how I wished he understood it was wrong. I didn't mean to make him cry, but I had never seen him shed tears before. I also confronted my mother. I asked why she let him act that way. Didn't she realize how awful it made me feel? I wanted to know why she didn't take action. Watching my parents cry made me realize how much they had aged. I couldn't stand it, so I knelt between their chairs and hugged them both. I wished for their love and for them to care for each other. We cried together, and then Dr. Jameson spoke softly to us for a long while. We all shared our feelings until we were too tired to continue. Mom explained that she discovered early on that she had little interest in being intimate. She told me she didn't like the idea of being exposed or the messiness involved. She said having me was one of the few times she let herself be open with Dad, and she was sorry there wasn't more she could do about it. She was the one who suggested Dad find someone else. Her sister was alone after losing her husband, and Mom thought it would be a good match since her sister had a good energy and was missing a partner. Dad was in good health and didn't have a woman in his life. Mom apologized for me finding out about it. Dad was sorry too. He knelt down and asked for my forgiveness, and I told him I forgave him, and I truly meant it. I didn't feel like I was running into a wall anymore. Dr. Jameson spoke with my parents for a few hours each day while they were here. When they left to go home, they both seemed much happier than I had seen in years. Mom was holding on to Dad like they were very much in love, like I used to feel with Mark. I feel much stronger now. It's been nearly 6 months since Dr. Jameson first helped me with hypnosis. I understand things more clearly now and can see many past actions and feelings that I realize were unwise. I can't believe I let myself get into those situations. I don't understand why I agreed to go out drinking with those girls. That was the beginning, I think. Dr. Jameson gave me a list of books to read, and it opened my eyes. Alcohol can really change a person. It dulls the mind and lowers your guard. Drinking a lot can be harmful. It makes the body work hard to get rid of the toxins and messes with how the body functions. Dr. Jameson helped me realize that I was drinking heavily to numb my feelings. But that just made me more open to Brian. It made it easier for him to take advantage of me, even though I didn't really care for him. I knew he saw every woman as a prize, and he didn't think of us as real people. I understood he wasn't a good person, and it hurt every time I let him into my life. Dr. Jameson and I talked about how I might have been lowering myself to feel closer to my parents and Aunt Ruth. They meant a lot to me for years. Deep down, I thought they were the best I could be, so I tried to be like them. But that approach was hurting me. I knew better because of my loving husband and daughter. It was tough to change, but I'm finally on the right path. We also discovered that I felt like Alyssa was competing for Mark's love. I realize now that it was silly, but it made me feel upset when she and Mark were together. Dr. Jameson, along with another expert she consulted, mentioned that I might have felt this way after Alyssa was born. Many call it postpartum depression, which is a kind of sadness that can happen after having a baby. I don't know why it gets so much attention because it can feel so unfair. Thankfully, I never experienced severe issues during that time. I never felt like I wanted to hurt myself or Alyssa. What I faced was simply being so tired all the time. But I struggled to sleep. I was often moody. I thought Mark didn't love me anymore, even though he kept telling me how much he cared. I felt distant from him and everyone else. Those old thoughts about my parents didn't help either. I was overwhelmed. I wanted to be a good mother, but I struggled. I found it painful to care for Alyssa, which made me upset. Because I was so irritable, Mark began giving Alyssa her formula and changing her more often than I did. He walked around with her when she cried. I don't think I ever got up at 2 a.m. to feed our baby. It was always my wonderful husband who did that. I realize now how special that was. Friends I talk to say they would have done anything for their partner to help even a little when their children were small. Dr. Jameson says my hormones might have changed too. For a long time, I didn't want Mark to be close to me. When I finally did, he didn't notice right away, and it took us a long time to reconnect. Even when we did, I felt like I was still holding back, although I'm not sure if I truly remember that or just recognize it now. Then I got involved with Brian, and everything got chaotic for me. I'm not sure if it was because things got crazy or if I let Brian influence me. I feel okay thinking about it that way. It might not be exact, but it doesn't upset me. And Dr. Jameson says that's what matters. I sometimes get really upset with myself. How could I have been so foolish? A lot of what I did when I was drinking and spending time with Brian doesn't make sense when I look back. It has been 8.5 months since my husband and I talked with Dr. Jameson about my first hypnotherapy session. She calls it deep relaxation hypnotherapy. She can get annoyed because she says anyone can hypnotize someone on stage. But a real expert can help people with their struggles using those techniques. She has taught me how to relax myself and helped me recognize when something bothers me from deep down. It's really simple, and it frustrates me that I didn't learn it sooner before things got so out of hand. Sometimes I feel a lot of shame for what happened with Brian. My parents and Aunt Ruth raised me better than that. They never behaved so openly. Dr. Jameson and I figured out that part of me was acting out against what I was doing. I realized I was increasing my drinking and my risky behavior so Mark would notice and put a stop to it. Looking back, it feels so hurtful and self-destructive. I knew Mark's work involved a big investigative agency, so I was bound to be found out eventually. Being careless about it only rushed the outcome. We still don't understand why I chose that way to try to stop my wrong choices. Dr. Jameson often reminds me that my subconscious doesn't process things like my mind does when I'm awake. That's unfortunate, but all this therapy is helping me understand myself much better. I know I won't fall into a bad place again. I'm aware of my feelings and how to keep an eye on myself now. I can share what I learn with others, too. Last week, I started volunteering at a hotline, and I think Shirley, one of the girls who used to hang out with me, will seek help for her drinking. I offered to take her to an AA meeting and find her a sponsor. She started crying because she was so grateful to have someone who cared. I felt really good about helping her. I'm going to support her all the way. Me? I tried to have a little wine recently, and it almost made me feel unwell. Christmas has come and gone. It's almost a year since I first learned about hypnosis. I see Alyssa a few times a week. Mark lets me see her whenever I want. I just have to call him. It's not the same as living with her and my husband, but it's better than nothing. She'll be 5 soon. She's growing up fast, and I wish I could be there more. When I visit Dr. Jameson, we don't have much to discuss anymore. I feel so lively and happy to be alive now. I truly feel good about myself. I know I made mistakes, but it feels like a different person made those choices. I'm not the same woman who pushed my husband away. I've been feeling restless lately. I haven't been close to my husband in a long time, and I miss him. I won't feel complete until I'm back with him and my daughter. I talked to Dr. Jameson about my worries. I told her I wasn't sure if Mark loved me anymore and felt stuck about what to do. She asked why I thought that, and I shared that he seems distant at times and doesn't like me to get too close or have private conversations. She made a sound like she was judging me, but now I just roll my eyes at her in my head. We only show our true feelings when it's just the two of us. She's become closer to me than my mother was for a long time, but even that has changed. My mom called recently, sounding really happy. She and Dad were going on a cruise to Jamaica to reconnect. I was surprised. It seems like Dr. Jameson's treatment and some additional counseling have helped my mom in ways I didn't expect. We cried together, and it was a good kind of cry. Anyway, I told Dr. Jameson I wanted to be with my husband again, but I wasn't sure if that could happen. He didn't seem to care. Once she finished being a little judgmental, she asked if Mark had finalized the divorce with his lawyer. He hadn't, but I thought maybe his lawyer advised against it, considering I was in therapy. Dr. Jameson held back a sniffle this time. She asked me if she had ever asked for anything in return for all the time we had spent together over the past year. She pointed out that Mark could have stopped our sessions any time he wanted by not paying, but he hadn't done that. I realized she was right, even though I hadn't thought about it like Dr. Jameson did. It changed my perspective. She also asked when the last time was that Mark had kept me from seeing Alyssa, and I knew he never had. She said I should think carefully about those things. They didn't seem like actions from someone who wanted to keep me away. I mentioned that I doubted Mark would want me back after everything that had happened between us. She laughed at my words, and I found it amusing, too. I really admire Dr. Jameson. She is always calm and collected. She explained that Mark was more hurt about the trust between us being broken than about anything else. His pain was less about the physical side of our relationship and more about feeling abandoned in our marriage. I never intended for any of this to happen. I recognized that deep down. If I had been clear-headed, I wouldn't have made the choices I did. It makes me uncomfortable when I think about the places we went and the late nights we spent out. Thinking back, I realized that except for a short time, I had only ever kissed Mark. Everything that happened is closely tied to the hurt I caused him and our child. I feel terrible about my actions, and I don't know how else to express my apology to Mark beyond what I have already said whenever he listens. Dr. Jameson asked if Mark would consider returning to counseling with me. She mentioned that he likely had a lot of feelings he needed to sort through. She suggested that if Mark saw I was working on myself and recovering, he might be willing to try to rebuild our marriage instead of walking away. I told her that the last time I had mentioned working with her to him, he didn't respond. Dr. Jameson asked how long ago that was, and I had to think. It had been several months. She reminded me that a lot can change in a short time. She said Mark might be waiting for a sign from me that I wanted to work with him to save our relationship, or, even better, to find a new way forward together. Then, our time was up because her next appointment arrived. All of this made me reflect. I noticed moments where Mark didn't seem to completely cut me off. I remembered seeing him watch me as I walked away after dropping off Alyssa, and I started to wonder if I had misread his expression, which could have shown pain instead of indifference. I think I'll call him tonight. He always gets home by 6 p.m. because he takes care of Alyssa full time. After dinner, they play games, watch Disney Channel, or read books together. He seems happy during that time. I think I will call him to see if he would like to join some of my therapy sessions. Maybe being there will help him understand how I am doing. I hope it means something to him. I want my husband back. I want to be his wife and partner more than anything. If he takes me back, I believe I can make our daughter happy again because she will have her mother with her. First, I need my husband back. I will do what it takes to win him over again. I want him to see that I am still his. I have a grandson, Carl said proudly. I looked at him over my coffee cup. I think sometimes I keep the coffee shop busy. I drink a lot of coffee. Recently, I had to switch to decaf in the afternoons, or I would be too jittery when I got home to Alyssa. Carl preferred tea, which seemed to help him avoid some of my stresses. Yes, I know, I replied. 2 of them. I've met them a couple of times. I had met them at every family picnic or dinner Carl brought them to. It wasn't really 2 times. I had seen his granddaughters and grandsons grow from babies to young children, but Carl shook his head. No, I have 3 grandsons. I tilted my head. I didn't know this. I stayed quiet. Carl had become a close friend over the past year and a half. He helped me uncover the truth about my wife's actions and then quietly ended the investigation team that assisted him. Only he and Maggie, my secretary, knew all the details. My daughter Janet's oldest son, Zane, has been in care for years, Carl said softly. He is 15 now. I didn't know, Carl, I said gently. I am so sorry. I should have paid more attention. I felt awful. He brushed it aside. It's okay, he replied. He was already in treatment in Colorado when I started here, and he isn't part of our daily lives anymore, though we visit him when we can. I nodded, feeling uneasy. I felt like I let him down. Zane is quite tall for his age. 6 feet already, Carl added, lost in thought. His weight goes up and down. He might weigh 250 pounds for some time, then forget to eat and drop down to 170 before you know it. Carl shifted in his chair, and the leather creaked beneath him. Zane doesn't really live in the present. He hears voices that trouble him, confuse him, and sometimes lead him to act out, Carl said, watching the way his coffee stirred in the mug with his hand. Physically, he's very strong, but mentally he's quite young and hard to manage. Some days he seems like a cheerful 10-year-old boy. Other days, when he's feeling paranoid, he becomes very difficult. My daughter couldn't handle him. He has been bigger and stronger than she is since he was 11, and we went through a tough time having him in a treatment center. Carl stirred his coffee that didn't need stirring, looking troubled. We hope they can help Zane learn to manage his challenges so he can take care of himself when he grows up, but we can't be sure. He can tell the difference between the voices in his head and real people now. We have hope for him. He's responded well to some treatments. He coughed lightly, glancing at me. Have you seen the movie A Beautiful Mind? He asked. I nodded. Well, he said, the doctors say that's like my grandson Zane. If you want to understand him, that's a good movie to watch. I nodded again, my eyes lost in thought as I recalled some of the heavy moments in that film. I shook my head gently. I'm really sorry, Carl, I said, unsure what else to say. I wish I had known, I added. He shook his head. There's nothing anyone can do, he said simply. I don't usually talk about such things just for fun. For the first time in a long while, he turned in his chair to face me directly. Boss, I'm not ashamed of my grandson, but I don't share much about him with anyone. My wife and I avoid talking about him because it brings up a lot of difficult feelings that we need to keep in check to get through our days. You understand? I did, and I knew my expression showed the sympathy I felt for him. He looked away. What I wanted to say is, it's not Zane's fault, you know? He didn't choose to struggle with his mind like this. We couldn't reach him or help him, Carl said, clearing his throat a few times and taking a long drink of coffee. It gave me time to reflect. Boss, he said carefully, you've let me into your life more than I expected. You've trusted me to manage my part of the company in my own way, and I appreciate that. I respect you more than anyone else I've worked for, and I think you respect me too. I nodded. I did. Here's the thing, boss, he started. I just can't sit and watch. I raised my hand to stop him. It's not Laura's fault either, I asked quietly. He nodded, looking at me to see how I would respond. I sighed. Carl had brought up something I had sensed for a while. Yeah, Carl, you're right, I finally said. I still have a problem more like a question about why Laura didn't share some of the things that were bothering her. But I've read a lot and I understand more now. I bit the inside of my cheek for a moment. I hear you, Carl. She didn't mean for her mind to play tricks on her, but some of what she did was so hurtful. My hands waved in frustration. Carl nodded, understanding my struggle. But Mark, he said gently, can you let that go? Deep down, can you see that if she had been herself, She would never have done those things? If she were the Laura you married, the Laura I know before she was overwhelmed by things she couldn't understand, she wouldn't have been unfaithful. You know that. I know you do. He watched me for a moment. I wanted to agree, but memories of that last night kept flooding my mind. Strangely, the anger Laura had felt that night in Las Vegas had also brought her out of a long fog. I had learned at least that much from Dr. Jameson. "Boss," Carl said calmly, "if Laura had been sick, going through chemotherapy, losing her hair and getting weak, would you blame her for being ill? Could you really do that?" I sat still for a long time. I had thought about this before, but Carl painted a vivid picture I couldn't ignore. He was asking me to look at my beliefs and question whether I was a real man or just a false idea of one. Did I want my pride and my natural dislike of the thought of Laura being with someone else to define my manhood? It felt like my thoughts were on display. Or maybe Carl was more insightful than I realized. "Mark," he said kindly, "if you met a young divorced woman, let's call her, Laura, and you thought about having a serious relationship with her, would you ask her how many previous partners she had, what their relationships were like? Would you?" he asked, challenging me. "I didn't think so," he concluded, seeing the answer on my face. Honestly, those details were none of my business. They were part of that fictional woman's private past. They were things a man marrying a divorced woman would learn to overlook. He would come to terms with her past as if it were normal, not feeling ashamed or wanting revenge. If he were strong enough, she would also accept his past, knowing he was with her now, not the other women from before. Suddenly, I remembered a few parties I went to with a girlfriend before I met Laura. I didn't think much about those crazy times. I hadn't thought of them in years, but some of my actions there weren't something I was proud of. Laura lived with that part of me, even though she never knew. Those moments shaped me just like the high school football games I played. They taught me what to avoid and who I didn't want to become. "Carl?" I asked, settling back into my comfortable chair. He raised his eyebrows in curiosity. "I know you have a degree in criminology, Carl. Did you also study psychology?" I asked with a small smile. He smiled back and shook his head. "Nope," he replied briefly. "But I was a police officer for 17 years, boss. You see a lot driving around in the patrol car." His expression became serious. "My grandson also taught me many things. I wish I had a better attitude when I started spending time with him." I raised my hand to signal him to stop. "Don't be hard on yourself, Carl," I said kindly. "We all learn as we go. And today I learned something, my friend." "Thank you," I said simply. "No problem," he replied with a grin. "You were already heading in that direction. I just helped you move along a bit faster, that's all." Just then the phone rang, interrupting our conversation. It was Maggie on the intercom. "Yes, Maggie," I said, pressing the button to put her on speaker. "Mark, Laura is on the phone," she said softly. I paused for a moment. "Please connect her," I finally replied. I turned to apologize to Carl for taking the call, but he was already slipping out the side door to his office. He gave me a thumbs-up sign before disappearing. "Doctor," I said softly, "I've found ways to deal with almost everything about this situation, but I still struggle to understand why my wife didn't talk to me about her concerns at the start. I might not have understood right away, but she could have at least said something." The doctor looked at me thoughtfully for a moment. I knew she remembered when I walked out more than a year ago after something she said upset me. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her with a slight smile. Her eyes widened briefly. She didn't expect me to understand her so easily. She smiled back at me. "She wasn't able to express her feelings clearly enough to understand them, Mark," the doctor said. "And that's if she even realized when her memories started to bother her," she added. "Laura didn't know how to deal with her feelings back then either." "I do now," Laura said firmly. "I'll talk to you about what worries me, even if it means barging in on you when you're having a moment," she finished. I blinked in surprise. You probably won't have to go that far," I said quietly. Both women laughed at the way my face turned red. It felt good to hear Laura's laughter. It had been a long time since I heard that sound. She held my hand tightly between hers. We were sitting close together, our arms brushing against each other. I felt comfortable with the closeness again. With Carl's help, I had crossed a line, and I wasn't going back. "As Laura said, Mark, She now has the skills to handle her feelings and any troubles that come to the surface. There's no sure thing, but she's much better equipped now. It's taken a long time for Laura to reach this stage, and we still have some things to work on, but she has won many of her inner battles. You two will still have things to talk about together, but Laura and I believe that there won't be so many issues hitting her at the same time anymore. What about you, Mark? The doctor asked. Are you okay with what we've talked about? I took a deep breath. Dr. Jameson, with the help of a good friend, I've worked through most of my concerns. I smiled briefly at the doctor, recalling how I had disliked that word a few months back. My friend shared about his young grandson, who has the same mental condition shown in the movie, A Beautiful Mind. Hearing about what Carl's family went through made me face my anger and put it into perspective. The doctor nodded, showing she understood my feelings and Carl's family's struggles. I had to rethink many things, I continued, and I let go of the anger I had been holding. I paused for a moment. I won't say I'm completely healed, but it's no longer the main thing I focus on, I added. I turned to my wife. There will be times when I might feel low and some of my frustration might slip out, and I might say things to hurt you, Laura, but I will work on getting better. And I won't stop trying, okay? Laura's eyes filled with tears. She could only nod and gently squeeze my hand. Honey, I said, part of me wants to say there's no reason for what you did and that I shouldn't let you back into my heart, into my life, but I refuse to give in to that feeling. I looked at my wife's kind face as she listened to me. The last time we were in Dr. Jameson's office, Laura was still weak and emotional. She had trouble looking me in the eyes. Now, she seemed more like the woman I married, maybe even a bit stronger than before. Sometimes a bond can grow stronger than the original fabric. I think if I can say I forgive you for what happened, but at the same time I can't pretend it didn't hurt, then I can move on, I said. I paused, hoping someone would respond, but no one did. We can't act like none of this ever took place, Laura. There has been too much pain for that to happen. I can cope, but I want to learn from these terrible events, Mark. Laura replied gently. I can't forget them, but if I use them as reminders of what I never want to experience again, they will help me. Do you understand? I did, and nodded. Is there anything else, Mark? Dr. Jameson asked after a moment of silence. I took a deep breath and relaxed my shoulders. I fear some men will see me as weak, someone to look down on, I admitted slowly. I wasn't used to being so open, especially with someone I didn't know well. I'll have to handle those men in ways they will understand. Their opinions might not matter to me, but it will still be a challenge. Dr. Jameson shook her head. I don't think you will face that, Mark, she said firmly. I haven't seen anyone like that in my practice. Those who are weak accept mistreatment without standing up for themselves. She glanced at Laura and smiled briefly before turning back to me. Laura and I have talked about a lot of things, she continued. If there has ever been a man who took strong action to stop what he wouldn't accept, it's you. She paused, raising her hand to emphasize her point. I've mentioned this before, Mark, but there's a side of you that you rarely show, especially not to Laura or to your child. You can be very firm and unyielding when someone wrongs you, and Laura understands that now. If nothing else has come from this experience, she knows you won't allow behavior like what she showed back then. She frowned slightly. Oh, and most people won't think less of you, she added. They will see your kindness and the love you both share rather than focus on the tough times that brought you here. She looked at me and smiled warmly. Still, if you have to challenge someone to a duel, then go for it, she said. I'll hold your coat while you take care of him, honey, Laura replied gently. Then we'll walk home together, okay? There was nothing left for me to do but kiss her. I struggled to buckle the car seat in the truck. It was tough because trucks aren't built for small kids or car seats, but I eventually managed it. Alyssa had been waiting for a while, almost losing her patience. As soon as I finished, she jumped into the seat. Hurry, Daddy, she said, wanting me to fasten her lap belt and shoulder straps. Shoes off or on, I teased. For a moment, my 5-year-old daughter paused. She was getting older, but she still loved to play the tickle game that usually came after taking her shoes off. She didn't really like the car seat now, but I wanted her to be safe. On, she decided. Let's go now, Daddy, I smiled. I'm going as fast as I can, honey, I assured her. I closed the passenger door, jogged around to show I was hurrying, and climbed into the truck. In a few minutes, we were driving quickly out into the countryside. We were on our way to Alyssa's Uncle Dan's house, and we couldn't get there fast enough. Laura had been staying with her brother Dan for the past year and a half while we worked on fixing our relationship. Today, my daughter and I were bringing her mother and my wife home where she belongs. But that didn't solve everything. Laura and I still had a lot of trust issues to work on. I know I watched her closely for a long time. My suspicions probably showed sometimes, but Laura always took the time to explain things when I asked. I think she felt frustrated on some level, but she handled it well. A couple of years ago, she called me in a panic, saying she was stuck in traffic and couldn't get home when she promised. I helped her calm down so she could drive safely. I could see on the traffic cameras there was a big accident ahead, causing a long backup on the highway. I suggested she take the next exit and gave her directions to avoid the traffic. The important thing is that her worry made me less anxious. I've mostly moved past my suspicions now, but we both remember why we are cautious about sudden delays. I always make sure to let her know if I'm going to be late. We don't discuss the reasons anymore. I sit in the dark of our living room, with only the moon shining softly through the window. I enjoy this time of night. There are no sounds from traffic and no rush outside to disturb me. It's quiet and calm, and it wraps around me like a gentle blanket. Hey everyone! Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.